Hello, I'm Dan Anderson, Associate Professor and Extension Specialist in the Ag and Biosystems Engineering Department. Today I'm going to be talking about carbon credits related to livestock agriculture. Uh, it's a little bit of an unknown, which is why it's lions and tigers and bears, oh my. But we'll try and take a look at what the world has in store for us, what people are looking at, and what options livestock producers may have available to them, and ultimately how that affects our ability to utilize manure as a fertilizer resource. So, we've talked for years about how nitrogen flows and opportunities for losses. And this is really just a continuation of that. But in addition to that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, it's becoming more and more relevant to start thinking about carbon and also other greenhouse gases and where they might originate from in different livestock operations. So, when I'm thinking about carbon flows in our manure systems, there's really two forms of carbon that are relevant to us, and then interestingly enough, one form of nitrogen that gets counted as a greenhouse gas. So the first one that we often think about and hear about when we talk about greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. Within the world of manure and agriculture, the only carbon dioxide that's relevant to us is if we're using electricity or if we're burning diesel fuel to power some of our equipment. That combustion causes the production of CO2. The CO2 that comes directly from the animal's breathing or that is respired from the manure as it breaks down during storage or after land application doesn't count against us. That carbon is called biogenic. And the reason it's biogenic is it was recently CO2. Our corn, soybean, or other feedstuffs for that animal incorporated it into that plant material. We fed it to the animal. Some of it partitions in the animal body, but the majority of it, roughly 80% of it, is respired back to the air. And because of that, it was in the atmosphere. We're putting it back in the atmosphere in the same form, CO2. It doesn't really change the amount of greenhouse gas that was in the air. With that said, a small fraction of the carbon in that plant material that ends up in the manure ends up being methane. And methane becomes really important to us because it's a very potent greenhouse gas. On a 100-year time period, it's estimated that it has about 29 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide. So it can be really important. And even though we're only converting small amounts of this carbon into methane, because of that potential, it really can have a huge impact on some of the greenhouse gas production that's estimated. And because of that, when we look at offset markets or markets that will pay us for not emitting some of that carbon, methane gets a prime time role. The other greenhouse gas that's important to us is N2O. That gas you might like when you go to the dentist. It's laughing gas. But in the world of agriculture, it really represents a loss of nitrogen. So we're trying to avoid it. And I think we've done a pretty decent job of that in Iowa for years, right? We want to turn our nitrogen into fertilizer, so we don't tend to have systems that make a lot of N2O. But all systems do make a little of that nitrous oxide, and we do have to think about how to manage it. With that said, it's a greenhouse gas that I think we don't know as much about in terms of how to eliminate it or reduce its production from some of our manure systems. So while I'm going to talk about it in a cursory way, right now we don't have great mitigation options. Unlike methane, where I think we've studied it for a while and have some pretty good ideas of how we might alter it. So this is really to set the stage about why we might even want to think about this as an issue and something that I think might impact us going forward. Traditionally, and by traditionally I mean 3 years ago, when we think about normal fertilizer prices that hadn't escalated, the nutrient value in pig manure per pig space was around $25. This last year, that might have escalated into the neighborhood of 60, 70, maybe even $80, depending on when you booked fertilizer prices. If we compare that to some of the ways that we can monetize these carbon emissions and credit from not having these carbon emissions, the two main programs that I tend to think about are RINs, it's a federal EPA program, and then LCFS, which is low carbon fuel standard programs. And those are often state driven. We might think of Washington, California, Oregon. We'll talk about them more in some details. But those credits can add up to $150 per pig space annually. And that's a pretty high margin, right? If we think about 150 and compare that to even high fertilizer prices now of 60 or 70, it's roughly double what that manure is generating from a fertilizer value. I think historically we've seen a lot of animal production, livestock production coming to Iowa because there was a chance to use this manure as a fertilizer and value add, right? We didn't have to think of manure as it's a cost center. How are we going to store it? How are we going to land apply it? We still had some of those costs, but it was also adding a benefit to us. And I think what we're seeing in this respect is maybe Iowa has some disadvantages when it comes to energy production. And that might start causing people to look elsewhere for places to site barns. It might also cause us to have to think a little bit more innovatively about how do we make sure those systems will fit here in Iowa. And I think that's why we're not in Kansas anymore, right? It's a little bit of waking up in a world in color where what traditionally has been our driver for why we might want livestock and manure might no longer be the driver. And we'll talk a little bit of long term about what that projection might look like, because while this is true today, I think that might not ultimately be the case depending on where some of these carbon markets settle. The other thing I wanted to point out is I have it written up here for pigs, but if you wanted to think about this as another livestock species, one that's getting a lot of attention is dairy cattle. And they're really where we've seen a lot of anaerobic digesters being installed in Iowa. We've had about 9 installed in the last year. And those credits add up to about $1,000 a cow. When I first heard that number, I thought, oh, I must have done this math wrong. It can't be that high because the going rate for a dairy cow is only a little more than that, $1,300. So the manure and those credits that we can generate from the manure are worth about half to two-thirds of the cow's value annually. So it is an interesting sort of perspective and world we live in when these credits are at those levels. So really what I'm going to try and talk through today are just how do we estimate carbon footprints for different operations and different types of manure systems? How does choosing your manure system impact this? That's not to say we should pick one manure system because of its carbon emissions, but rather how do we fall in relationship to other manure systems relative to that? We'll look through what are some of the options that people are looking at for treatment and maybe some of the economics behind it. And then we'll finish up talking about that anaerobic digestion, impermeable covers, and what I think systems might have to look like in order to be feasible here in Iowa. I did want to mention a couple things. When we look at greenhouse gases overall, about 15% of the greenhouse gases that are generated by humans come from livestock production. I'm not here saying that we are causing global warming. We are a very small part of it, right? 15%. If we got rid of all livestock emissions, it would barely be noticeable on the global scale. Rather, I'm here talking about them because there are market opportunities developing, and I think it's important for us to think about how we fit in those and what incentives we could recover because of them. And then the other component of that is we do see a lot of the livestock industries talking about sustainability. I've seen National Pork put out some information that they want to work towards a carbon neutral pig. We've seen the same thing in the dairy industry. And then we've seen company pledges from people like Smithfield pledging to reduce their greenhouse gases along their whole production chain by 30%, as well as Nestle pledging that they would get to net zero in their production chain. And that puts a lot of pressure on us to make sure that we're working in the right direction to help them meet their goals so that those supply chains and sales can stay open to us. There's also been talk about Walmart sort of putting the same pressures on that you will get your carbon emissions or your carbon footprint down to some level in order for that to be a viable option to keep selling. So while it's not something that is putting immediate pressure on us today, we have to do something. It is something long term that in order to meet some of these companies' sustainability goals might have to be relevant to us. Just like I talk about when we talk about nutrient value of manure, every choice we make along our production chain influences how much operation a loss we're going to have of different greenhouse gases. So if we're choosing to build a bedded pack barn for our beef cattle versus a deep pit, well, the bedded pack will keep the manure drier. Because it's drier, we won't have nearly as much methane production. On the other hand, because it's a dry solid manure, it tends to have a little bit more N2O emissions. So there's some trade-offs there, and how do we ultimately decide which one wins? And this follows through in all the decisions we make, whether we're separating solids from those manures, and because the solids are out, partitioning the carbon differently, or as you can see on the bottom, putting an impermeable cover on it to catch that methane, all the way through using that carbon in the manure to help build soil health and organic matter within our soil so that we continue to have some of the greatest soils in the world. There are only a few limited markets really that are working with livestock manures on the current time. The most relevant or the largest markets out there are the LCFS markets. Those are low carbon fuel standard markets. In order to collect revenue from that market, it's not just offsetting some of our emissions, it's going through all the way to make some sort of biofuel product. Most people who are doing that are using methane, compressed natural gas, cleaning up that methane that's produced from their manures and injecting it into a pipeline. And in the picture there you see on the top is a system to do that. It essentially removes carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide from the biogas that we make and gets us to something like 93-94% of methane, which will meet most pipeline standards. There are a few other places that it's monetized. The big one that's controlled by the federal government is the RIN market. You might have heard of RINs. There's a few different grades, and again, we'll talk about them in more detail later. But it was really an EPA program to help the production of biofuels. Oftentimes, we think about it from ethanol or especially cellulosic ethanol. And while we did have two cellulosic ethanol plants get constructed in Iowa, uh, they aren't currently in operation. And because of that, there is this demand for cellulosic biofuels that has been mandated by the government. And anaerobic digestion of manure to make that methane was deemed to qualify as that type of fuel, which gives it a relatively lucrative sales opportunity. But again, you have to be going all the way to making that renewable fuel. And oftentimes that's in the form of methane, although the US government did recently say that there'll be electricity production that can qualify for RINs, and that might open up some new opportunities. One place that I think gets a lot of discussion on the agricultural side is with carbon credits. We see some companies out there marketing carbon storage opportunities in soil, and they might pay a farmer for performing different practices such as cover crops or reducing tillage, and then that causes more carbon to be stored in the soil. And they would try and market those credits to places like Google, Walmart, other companies that want to improve their carbon footprint. Most of those companies right now aren't actually dealing with offset credits from manure. When I look around, there's really only one opportunity for us, and that's the California offset market. And again, that's a government mandated market that really is tailored to their electricity production, often targeting coal power plants in California, saying that unless you put in mitigation technology, you need to be buying credits from someone else who is doing something to reduce their greenhouse gas production. That market has been relatively stable for the last few years and sells for about $30 per ton, which is relatively competitive with what you might see for some of those soil credits that we've seen before. And then the last aspect of this is just really increased sustainability. As I mentioned, we have seen pledges from a few companies to try and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions across their supply chain. And especially with Smithfield, they've seen some opportunities with the livestock manure playing a portion of the reduction that they're trying to get and implementing systems on that side. And that's something that I expect to see to continue, especially if we continue to see climate programs, climate smart programs that really valorize or add opportunities for some of our livestock producers. I did mention there's a few types of greenhouse gases, but the most important one in livestock really is that methane generation. And there's a few things that can impact how much methane our manure makes. And the big ones for us to start with are how much manure are we making and how much good, solid organic matter is in that manure. So, what you're feeding your animal, whether you have a pig or a cow, influences how much manure they make, and also how much of that manure ends up being digested and utilized by the animal, and how much gets excreted in the manure. There are a few other parts that really influence how much of that potential methane that we have sitting there gets converted into actual production during storage, and things like how long we store it, whether it's 6 months and we're applying twice a year, or if we're holding it and applying annually, can add up and make a difference. And then some things that we don't have as much control over also make a difference. So temperature. Microbes like warmer temperatures. So in warmer locations, we tend to make more methane. All of Iowa is relatively similar, but because of that, if you would start comparing Iowa to a place like North Carolina, well, the same manure storage, manure management system in North Carolina would have greater emissions than it would in here in Iowa, just because they're warmer and have more active bacteria because of that. I think that's an area where lots of people, myself included, do some research, and I just wanted to give you an idea of sort of how much methane different manures could make and how people do that sort of research. So I have a series of pictures here to walk us through the process. We'll keep some specific bacteria around. We'll call it inoculum. Really, that's a fancy word for there's some anaerobic bacteria in here to start eating whatever I feed them. My reactor that I run in my lab there is in the picture on The side of the screen, it looks like just a round PVC pipe because that's what it is, surrounded by a heating blanket, and then laboratory controlled to keep it at a specific heat of roughly 100 degrees Fahrenheit, some mixing pumps and feeding pumps to take some material in and out. But it really is just about growing bacteria. I feed mine manure or feed mine dog food because it's easy to procure, relatively consistent, and gives me a nice consistent concentration of bacteria in there. In a real digester, we'd feed it with manure, right? And we'd have some variability in gas production and how much bacteria are in there because of manure is a little bit different every day. And this just gives me a more controlled environment. What you then do is take some of that inoculum, some other minerals in water, and then a small amount of whatever material you want to test. In my case, that's typically livestock manures, but it could be things like cover crops or waste food from Hy-Vee or restaurant scraps or grease from Hickory Park here in Ames. Put it in that bottle, mix them up, keep them at 35 degrees Celsius, come back periodically and poke them with a syringe. That syringe will let the gas into it, and from that I can read how much biogas I've made and then run it through a methane analyzer, and it'll give me a percent methane. So if I do that for long enough until gas production ceases, which is typically right around 28, 30 days, I can figure out how much methane I really made from what I put into that little mini reactor. And if I have that information, I know how much potential biogas we could make from different things. People have done that for lots of different manures. I've done that for lots of different manures. The graph on the left here is really just to illustrate that many of the things that you're already doing will help lower how much methane your manure could make. So what I have is we fed 3 different diet types, either SBM, soybean meal mixed with corn, DDGS, so distillers grain with solubles mixed with corn, or soy hulls mixed with corn in a pig diet at 2 different grind sizes, either coarse, roughly 700 microns, or F fine, that would be roughly 350 microns. And then I took that manure that each of those pigs fed these different diets generated and measured how much biogas came out of them. Probably not a surprise, coarse ground feed isn't as digestible as the animal, right? And that's one of the reasons why we've seen many pig producers start to grind their feed faster. They want better feed conversion efficiency. We want to turn that feed that we're feeding the animal into meat. And by doing so, the 3 bars on the left there, you can see, are all lower than the 3 bars on the right. So what that says to me is, well, a lot of that carbon ended up being digested in the animal. It didn't end up in the manure. And because it ended up in the animal, well, that potential to turn it into methane isn't present any longer. The other thing you can see there is that feeding less digestible, in this case DDGS, ingredients in the diet, right? And it's probably not a surprise that it's less digestible. We've already digested it once to turn some of it into ethanol, and we're feeding a more fibrous product of what's left to the pig. Increases gas production, methane production, relative to what we might have fed 15 years ago in a corn soybean diet, right? And it makes sense to us, but it also might say that, well, we're doing some things that are potentially increasing how much methane we might make from the manure. On the right-hand side there, I have a couple tables of what people have measured for different manures. The more important one is summarized there on the bottom. For most swine production systems, we think we get roughly half a liter of methane per gram of volatile solids. And dairy is a little bit less digestible. And again, that relates to sort of how we're fed. Dairy does a better job of breaking down some of the fiber due to their digestion system, and it comes up with a greater percentage of lignin in the manure. And, well, bacteria in anaerobic conditions can't break down lignin, but they can break down many of those fibers. So diet makes a difference, but oftentimes when we're just starting to estimate projects, we'll look at how much do we think we would make from general species of sort of universal style diets. I mentioned that temperature is important, and there's a rule of thumb that says biological activity approximately doubles for every 10 degrees Celsius rise. So for every 20 degrees Fahrenheit temperature increase, the bacteria will break down stuff in that manure about twice as fast. And that really relates to that methane conversion rate. And that's why I mentioned that temperature is important and why we might see more methane production in North Carolina from a manure than we would in Iowa. And that's something that in most systems we don't have much control over, right? If we're storing manure, the manure's at whatever temperature it naturally sits at. But it also means that in some of these treatment systems where we want to capture methane, heat and adding waste heat can be valuable to us to help make that reaction a little faster, and hopefully as a result our tank size a little smaller. Now the fun part, how much of this stuff do we actually make? And you might say, why are you presenting this in kilograms? I'm in the United States. I want to think about it in terms of pounds. And I'll try and remember to say what the pounds are. But the reason I'm thinking about it in kilograms is when you look at the carbon markets that are out there, they're all working in metric tons, and that metric ton is 1,000 kilograms. So, since the markets that we might think of selling into are on that basis, I think it makes a lot of sense to try and learn to think about and utilize that as how much are we making and how much might this be worth. So I mentioned it's really related to how much volatile solids we make. We can estimate that reasonably well for a pig. It certainly is diet dependent, but we get a pretty good estimate. Like I said, we have tables that tell us the methane potential. So you can see number two there is roughly that half a liter or half a cubic meter per kilogram of volatile solids. I looked up the average temperature, and based on that temperature, you can say how active the bacteria were. You multiply those all together, and you come up with that we're producing roughly 7 kilograms of methane per pig space per year in an Iowa deep pit finishing operation. I did go out and measure this at about 60 farms in Iowa and have looked at what some other people found in literature from 15 farms in around the United States. And most of the data that people have tends to be a little bit higher than that. I think that has a lot to do with how frequently we are emptying our manure pit and probably a little bit to do with that switch from that corn soybean meal diet to something more like corn distillers grains as the primary diet and increased gas production. How different those numbers are if we are on a swine producing farm that pumps twice a year, I'm right in line with what the other people have estimated using the other methodology. And I think that's generally the assumption they're making. So manure management practices can make a little bit of a difference. And I think as we get better accounting, we'll see people take that into consideration a little bit more. I did want to talk at least briefly about different styles of swine housing and what that means. In Iowa, we tend to either have a deep pit, which is our predominant housing, a few lagoon systems, often more on the farrowing side than maybe on the finishing side, and then in special cases, some bedded pack. And I might think of more Neiman Ranch or some of the smaller producers who are trying to raise uh, pigs who might use that bedded pack system. And I'm showing you what form of emissions they have in terms of greenhouse gases with both methane and nitrous oxide, and then turning them into CO2 equivalents. And I think when I look at this, I see deep pits and bedded packs are hanging out about the same. Certainly, the form of how we're losing a greenhouse gas, whether it be methane or nitrous oxide, differs between the two. Uh, but lagoons sort of stand out in that they're almost double how much greenhouse gas per head we'd make from a deep pit. And that becomes important to us because it sets the baseline. When we think about these carbon markets, they're really about what's the baseline and what are you going to do to mitigate them. So what that means is if we would take a farm that had a lagoon and a farm that had a deep pit, well, that lagoon, if they could find a way to get that number down to zero, they'd make roughly 2 to 3 times the same amount of money from as a deep pit farm that went from where we're at today to getting our emissions down to zero, right? Because their baseline emissions are higher. Um, and we're seeing that in where a lot of these practices are getting implemented, right? We're choosing to put them on farms that currently have lagoons instead of deep pits because their baseline's higher and it makes a bigger impact on what the emissions are and how much money they can monetize from putting into practice. I did want to walk through at least a few different treatment options out there. Certainly, we've seen most of the implementation go to that either covered storages or anaerobic digestion. And they do have a much higher payment per ton of carbon if you go to that where you're making a biofuel. With that said, I think there's scale issues with some of those, especially for some of our Iowa farms that may not make them feasible, or we'll have to think more innovatively about how to make those systems feasible. And some of these other treatment options like aeration or solid separation might be something that in the near term are much more achievable for us. So if you told me today, someone came up and said, I need you to reduce your greenhouse gases emissions by some number. How are you going to do it? The first thing I would say is, well, let's think about our manure situation and maybe go from once a year application to making sure we're getting it done twice a year or even more often. And if you take the Iowa numbers that I've measured and would say we'd go from a fall emptying only system to emptying both fall and the spring, I get about a 46% reduction in how much methane's coming out of that manure. Um, So a relatively simple thing, right? We're just going to try and apply more often, and we can get a pretty nice reduction from that. Of course, it doesn't take us down to zero emissions, but a 50% reduction still has a chance to make us at least some money back, or meet the sustainability goal that someone's asking us to meet. If we would extend this a little and say, what happens if we could do it in season? And there might be a few ways to do this. On the bottom there, I have a picture of a side dressing application. So that does pull the drag line over the corn. Most of the research work that's been on that says it needs to be done before V4 at V4 in order to not snap off the corn. They are coming up with systems where it's more of an irrigation style moving through the field. So I have a Rain 360 shown on the top there. We'll be doing some research work with that starting this year. That might allow us to put manure onto standing corn much later into the growing season. Its boom is 12 feet off the ground. Its belly is about 10 feet off the ground, so it can go through relatively high corn. If you would move to a system like that, I think a 70% reduction in methane is pretty achievable. I'm not making any fuel in this case, so I do have to work with an offset market. So the California offset market is the only one today that is sort of selling carbon credits that manure might be able to capture. It's worth about $30 a ton if I take my emissions and what that might be worth. I think I'm looking at somewhere between $3 and $6.50 per pig space per year to help me pay for some of that equipment. Does it necessarily pay for it? No, it'll take a little bit more than just those carbon credits to get there, but we might, from our improved nitrogen timing, be able to see nitrogen use efficiency improvements, get more fertilizer value from our manure, and hopefully between the two of them, we can find ways to get those to add up to something that is cost feasible to buy. And that's what the research that we're just starting with that Rain 360 is going to look at. How much does it improve nitrogen utilization efficiency, and then how does it improve some of those greenhouse gas emissions? Uh, for years, we've seen people put different types of impermeable materials on their storage as a cover. The most popular one, at least here in Iowa and generally around the Midwest, has been to chop and blow corn stover on top of the manure. It is pretty effective at both reducing ammonia emissions and at reducing some of those methane emissions as well. We might see something like a 35% reduction in methane emissions from doing that. It is effective as long as that corn is still floating on top of the surface. Most of the research that's out there says it will sink. Thicker covers will float longer, but it is related to the weather conditions that we see as well. So if it's a really rainy year and that corn stover starts to get wet, it often will sink, not be as effective. And it also means that come pumping time, it is something that we have to mix up and handle, but it is something we know that can be relatively effective. And we have in the past seen people utilize this technology even without the help of carbon credits, often because of the odor mitigation potential it can provide. Sometimes it does make some of the pumpers' jobs a little bit harder. It is sometimes harder to get that corn stover mixed back up and suspended. Just a monetary example of that, I'm just going to look at a dairy operation in Iowa and say one gets a crust and one doesn't get a crust. I know that most of the time with manure, we tend to not like crusts. It's something that we have to break up when it comes time to agitate. But there is lots of great work that says that by getting a crust on the manure, we do mitigate methane emissions roughly the same as a straw cover would. So if you look at this and said I have a dairy manure that doesn't crust, I'd estimate almost 2 tons, metric tons of CO2 equivalents per cow per year. If you have a cover on it, you get that down to 1.2 tons per cow per year. So again, a pretty nice reduction if you start thinking about what's that worth. Well, on that offset market, hopefully we could generate somewhere in the neighborhood of $18 a cow space per year, which could be a pretty nice payment and probably will pay for that chopping up the corn stover and putting it on, depending on what the hassle is for manure management and getting it mixed with your applicator afterwards. Another one is solid separation, and this really is based on how well we do separating the solids. So the type of solid separator you have really does make a difference. There's a few out there that people think about and utilize. The most commons on dairy probably are belt presses and screw presses, with some settling also occurring. Oftentimes we're seeing people use screw presses for bedding. If you're a dairy that is already using a screw press, I'm sorry, you can't capture these carbon credits, right? It has to be a change in your behavior. So you'd have to switch from not using a solid separator to using a solid separator to obtain those credits. But if it's something you're on the fence about and say, I've been thinking about putting this in to make a bedding product, well, this might be another opportunity to provide a cost mechanism to help you pay for it, right? We're going to get that bedding recovery and also get some funding from these carbon credits. Uh, If I start saying, what's that worth? I'm going to say, well, I'm going to do a dairy again. If I wasn't solid separating, the truth is I'm probably getting a crust on my dairy manure, especially in that stage one manure storage. So I'm going to start at that 1200 per cow. If I was separating, I might be able to bring that down to about a ton per cow. I do have to track what happens to both the liquid and the solid manure in this case. Most of the reduction is on that liquid manure, and then on the solid manure with composting, we do have some emissions, but they tend to be a little smaller. If I start thinking about what's that worth, it should work out to somewhere around $5 to $7 a cow, uh, which isn't a bad payment, but it probably doesn't pay for your separator, so you would need a different additional advantage to help pay for that equipment if that was your goal. There is some work being done on manure acidification. People have found it to be relatively effective. We want to get the pH down to about 4.5, 4. And similar to what we're doing when we're making silage as a feedstuff, we're trying to get the same thing to happen here. We're dropping the pH low enough that bacteria aren't happy, don't function, and as a result of them not functioning, they won't make methane. Historically, this has been quite expensive to do. We've had to buy an acid and throw it in the manure. I do have some concerns with that, especially in Iowa. If you're starting with a concrete manure pit, concrete tends to not like acid, right? Acid will dissolve concrete. So making sure that we don't get localized zones of really low pH or we're spilling that acid directly on our concrete is important to make sure that we're not wrecking our storage. But there are some options there. There are a few companies that have recently started to try acid production systems with on a farm. One is owned by the Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, or at least a portion of that company, and he has started trying to market it both in Wisconsin and Iowa. I think it's seen more implementation on dairy farms, but essentially what that system would do is it makes nitric acid. Uh, which is what lightning makes, and his system is very similar to that. It's sort of lightning in a bottle. Make that acid, put it in the manure, and they're claiming that because they're doing that, it will reduce ammonia emissions. The science certainly says it will. It's related to how low we get the pH. It will reduce methane emissions. You could capture some of those, of course, and utilize them on a carbon credit market. And then the last thing, since they are adding nitric acid, we're adding more nitrogen to the manure, increasing the manure nutrient concentration. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, I think comes down to your operation and sort of what your footprint already is on how much manure you have relative to how much land you have to utilize it all. One of the newer ones, at least in how it's being implemented, is more manure aeration. And I think we've seen manure aeration for a long time, but normally when we talked about it, it was a complete aeration system. And honestly, that is what my calculation here is based on because it's what most of the science is based on. What we're going to do is rather than let that manure sit in our pit and become anaerobic, we're going to bubble oxygen through it. And by bubbling that oxygen through it, the methanogens, the bacteria that make methane, aren't happy, right? And because they're not happy, they won't make methane. So we can see a really big reduction in how much CO2 we're making, or at least CO2 equivalents we are. Certainly, this does cost a little electricity, and I'll try and talk through what that might take. But we can see almost complete elimination of many of the greenhouse gases. On the right, I do have a picture of a system being installed at a deep pit barn here in Iowa. There have been a couple people who have decided to give them a try, hoping that the aeration would reduce ammonia emissions. The research that's out there says it will either increase emissions by 10% all the way to reducing it by 30%, depending on how good of a job you're doing of bubbling. Too vigorous a bubbling of air through that manure tends to cause more nitrogen loss. If we can have it nice, slow aeration that doesn't cause much of that ammonia to migrate to the surface of the manure, we can actually see some savings. The other thing it does is it helps break down the solids within the manure quite a bit, much more so in the summer than in the winter because it is a temperature-driven process. But aerobic reactions tend to be a lot more energetic, and because of that, bacteria can operate much faster if there's air. So they're hoping that that might make it easier to agitate and pump out the manure, as well as that low rate of bubbling always occurring might make the manure a little fluffier and keep more solids suspended in it, giving it a more homogeneous product. So there are some opportunities besides just the carbon credits that come from these, but we're going to focus on the carbon credits today. So if I figure out what that's worth at that offset price, which is what we could generate, I'm at about $9 per pig space a year. If we were doing complete aeration and think about how efficient most of these things are, uh, I'm going to take about 750 of that to pay for the electricity I'm using, right? Leaving me with about $1.50 a pig space to pay for the installation of whatever system I choose. With that said, many of these newer systems are utilizing low rate aeration. So rather than trying to oxidize all the biochemical oxygen demand in the manure, they're trying to just disrupt methanogens within the manure. I think that's a good idea, especially on the carbon credit market, but it remains to be seen sort of how effective it will be for breaking down solids, controlling odor, and then nitrogen retention because of that. So that's an area where I think we'll see a lot more active research in the next couple of years because these carbon credit programs might incentivize it, and especially with some additional opportunities for improved manure management because of it, it might be something that we see people want to try out on their farms. Then the last two I wanted to talk about were manure storage, covers, and anaerobic digestion. So covers are something that we haven't seen as popular here in Iowa, mostly because of our colder temperatures. And relative to those colder temperatures, we've invested in more deep pit storages rather than outdoor lagoons. If you start thinking about a standard storage, though, and going with methane capture and just combusting it, right, not even trying to get any use from it, we can get that CO2 production from equivalent production from our manure down to about 150 or 1/10 of what it would have been otherwise, right? If you start thinking about, well, I'm going to capture and use it for something, whether that be put it on the pipeline or burn it for electricity, we can get that down pretty close to zero emissions from our manure, right? Which is one of the reasons why we've seen a fair amount of implementation of this, along with the fact that just putting a cover on a manure storage can be relatively cost effective as an option, especially if we have lots of animals at one location and can sort of utilize some of the infrastructure we built for more than one farm. Anaerobic digesters are sort of that, but at a more engineered scale. This is an example from a beef farm here in Iowa. It is an in-ground plug flow digester. It will give you a reduction. How much that reduction you get is really depends on how good the digester is performing. So how well are we going to heat it? How well is it mixed? Things like that. But it does give us a chance to hit some of those negative emissions per cow or per pig per year. But there are some challenges with scale. I wanted to highlight these a little bit more just because those are some of what we have been looking into. So anaerobic digestion, at least in concept, is relatively simple. In liquid manures, anaerobic digestion occurs whether we want it to or not, right? So when I talk about anaerobic digestion here, it's more of a in a controlled, let's encourage it to happen sort of way. So we're going to take manures and other ag residues. Most of the time I think about manures, but we have seen people interested in what can we add into these digesters to help increase how much gas we get from manure. With Verbio in Nevada, thinking about utilizing corn stover, and some of the other ones thinking about using cover crops or other crop residues. We put them in a container, try and keep that container free of air. Don't worry about what microbes are there because anaerobic digestion occurs with a consortium of microbes that really are going to try and work towards that methane all at once. And what we come out with is a treated effluent. That treated effluent is a fancy name for something that stills a lot like manure. It will have a lower amount of pathogens in it. All the nutrients that we started with, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, will still be in it, but it should have less odor. Coming off that anaerobic digester will make a gas, methane, and that's really the product from an energy standpoint that we want. And then it will make some CO2 as well. And as I mentioned, that CO2 is biogenic, right? It was CO2 in the atmosphere. We turned it into plant material for some period of time, and now we're transforming it back into carbon dioxide. The big advantage of anaerobic digestion, at least relative to other conversion pathways when we think about manure, is I don't need sterile reactors. And with manure, it's almost impossible to be sterile, right? It's going to be dirty. It does give us automatic product separation, so that's pretty nice, right? The methane will bubble up to the surface and rather than staying dissolved, so we don't need fancy equipment to try and separate it, which is good since it's relatively dirty. Membranes and things like that can get dirty if we try and use those. And really, historically, the struggle has been how does it compete economically for either price with electricity or compressed natural gas? And for the most part, other than in a few select situations where the farm is relatively big or we're getting a higher price for our electricity, we haven't seen it compete as well. With that said, some of these new carbon credit programs, those RINs and those LCFS opportunities, have changed that, right? They've really changed sort of the economics of what we're trying to make. And rather than making that gas or the electricity, we're really trying to generate those credits, and those credits are what pay for the operation, with the electricity and compressed natural gas being the thing we needed to generate to actually earn the credits. The big disadvantage of anaerobic digestion, and we'll talk about this a little bit, especially relative to other things, is it's a pretty slow reaction. And by that, I mean it's going to take us a long time in a tank, which yields to big tanks. And then we don't get a lot of whatever we're trying to make out of that tank per unit volume. Just to give you an idea of how long these things take, if we think about traditional ethanol production, right, where we're making ethanol from corn grain, that might be a 2-day process. If we're making soy diesel, so trans-esterification to make biodiesel, that tends to be about a 2-hour process. On the other hand, if we're using anaerobic digestion, especially lignocellulosic feedstocks, which is where I would classify manures and corn stover, that might be a 1 to 2 month process, right? So when you start thinking about how much space do I need or how big is my tank, well, that's a really long storage time compared to some of these other uh, bioenergy production methods. I just wanted to show you a few pictures of what these digesters look like in practice. This is a picture of a covered lagoon. Both the one that's already covered there and the one that is being constructed are down in Texas that I had an opportunity to look at. People love these if you have a lagoon because they're relatively low cost. All we have to do is put a cover on top of them and then build a gas cleaning system, which can help save a fair amount of cost in building them. They are pretty slow. They tend to not be heated, so they are how well they function is really related to where they are. So warmer places, North Carolina, Texas, see much more impact on their lagoon making methane than a place like Iowa, where it's chilly and essentially for 4 months of the year: November, December, January, February, and probably part of March. We won't make any methane at all. So it isn't something that in our climate we're going to see much implementation of, but we might see a little, especially if you can find ways to maybe heat it just a little bit. Another digester that's relatively popular, actually it's been quite popular on dairies in New York and Wisconsin, is this completely mixed digester. Oftentimes those will be above ground tanks, either built out of concrete or those slurry store tanks, where we use some pumps to keep it mixed up. And they will be heated to roughly 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Heating can be an energy sink, right? We're going to have to add some energy to do that. Generally, we're going to try and insulate our digesters so that about 15% of the gas that we make from them has to be used for heat. More insulation can help reduce that heating load, but it tends to not be cost effective to do. Less insulation is possible, but especially in some of our colder climates, again, you're wasting some of that product that you could have made. They tend to work relatively well with flush or scrape manure that has less than 10% solids. So when I think of pig manure or dairy cattle manure, we're often in that range where completely mixed digesters make a lot of sense. Plug flow digesters work a little bit better for more solids rich manure, and often I like sort of 10 to 15% solids. So if you're going to take beef cattle manure, or if you're going to start mixing in a co-substrate like that corn stover or cover crops, this might be a better option than a completely mixed digester. Most of the ones that we've seen constructed are built in this U shape, so I often think of a plug being a straight line. But what would happen in the picture that we're looking at there is the manure would be loaded in the far end of one of those two channels. It flows down towards us, has to turn the corner, and then it flows back out the other side where we pump it out. The one disadvantage of this style digester is they often don't have as much mixing in it. They will tend to have some mixing where they're turning the corner to help things get around the corner. But because of that, if you have much sand in there or using sand bedding, we can see a fair amount of solid settling in, and they don't perform as well. Making digesters pay really is about size and scale, and we'll try and talk through a little bit of that. But since digesters are going to rely on making a transportation fuel, there's really two options for us. One is to make methane quality biogas, so 94% pure methane. That does require a sophisticated cleaning system. We're going to compress it, put it in a pipeline, and then somewhere out there, someone with a natural gas vehicle will hopefully utilize that methane. There are companies that will help you, if you're making methane, find a buyer on the back end. And you have to do that throughout the whole supply chain to really take advantage of these credits. I know what you're thinking. how many people really drive these compressed natural gas vehicles? It is a very small percentage of our fleet in the United States, but there are those cars out there, and because of the limited number of these projects that have already been implemented, it is something where there is still opportunities there. Recently, the government, federal government EPA, did say they would look into allowing a pathway of making electricity rather than having to make compressed natural gas. I think that might give us some opportunities on some of our smaller scale farms because the gas cleaning system and the pipeline hookup tend to be relatively expensive, at least in the Midwest. A pipeline hookup probably is in the neighborhood of $1 million. It does take a pretty big farm to pay back that $1 million hookup. On the other hand, making electricity, certainly there'll be a system to help us make the methane, but a generator might be $100,000, $200,000, so substantially cheaper as an option. With that said, sometimes the credits won't be as good for making electricity as it would be for making natural gas. Um, and what they exactly work out to be is still remains to be seen because we haven't seen this electricity pathway approved, although EPA said it would be approvable now. RINs are really important to us, so I just wanted to give you an idea of what RINs are worth and what they're selling for. Uh, so the blue line on the graph, that's a D3 RIN, and RINs get a classification based on what percentage of greenhouse gas reduction they're achieving based on an EPA well-to-wheel analysis, right? So just a comparison of fuel to fuel that you're generating. EPA has said that manures, other ag residues will qualify for a D3 RIN. If you're taking food waste from a restaurant, a slaughter plant, that is only a D5 qualification. And that sort of blue line to the other three lines is giving you a comparison of what RINs are worth. The D3 RIN is always going to be the most valuable. It's the rarest to be made, right? And it is normally 2 to 3 times the price of those other RINs, depending on market. The other thing I wanted to point out is sort of how these credits compare to making natural gas, right? So the current price for natural gas is around $8 per MMBTU. That D3 RIN, which is roughly $3 per gallon of gasoline equivalent, works out to about $35 per MMBTU. So the credit we're generating there is worth a little more than 4.5 times the actual gas that we're making, right? So you might think of, well, a digester, it makes electricity or it's making natural gas, and it does. But the truth is we're really doing it to collect these credits, right? These carbon credits. The LCFS is another version of that. It's stackable with RINs, which makes it pretty nice from making projects cash flow perspective. So I can collect both those RINs and LCFS. LCFS is a state-driven program, so the states get to write the rules for how they would work. There are 4 LCFS programs currently, California, Washington, Oregon, and 1 from Canada. In order to sell them, you either need to be on their electric grid, which we're not, right? So we aren't going to be able to make electricity. To collect these, you have to be then making natural gas and putting it in the pipeline. You will get a carbon intensity score. Essentially, that uses a model called the GREET model to calculate what your emissions would have been compared to what they are now that we implemented this product and are collecting this biogas. If I do this for rough farms, right, and try and say roughly what I think carbon intensity scores will be, if you're a dairy farm or a swine farm with a lagoon, you're going to be roughly negative 300 grams of CO2 equivalents per megajoule of energy you make. If you're a deep pit and convert, hopefully you'll be in that negative 100 to negative 200 range. More negative is better, right? It means we're saving more carbon rather than making carbon as we're using this fuel. So the more negative you are, the better. Once you do this, you have to report how much energy you actually put in the pipeline, and you can figure out that roughly from your size of projects and what it's worth. But I'm showing you a projection for a 4,800 head swine farm. They'd save roughly 2,700 tons of carbon equivalents a year. You can look up what the going rate for price is. California was about 200 here. It did crash more recently. It tends to rebound depending on what the demand is, and that's a little bit government controlled. They can sort of set what people need to meet relative to what's being produced. And it works out to about $400,000 per year for a farm of that size. The one struggle with this one is we can't make electricity and qualify, at least as long as we don't have an LCFS state on our electric grid. This is a little bit of an eye test, but I wanted to show you sort of how these projects work or what might look like from an economic perspective. And I did some value of what things are worth, right? What is odor savings worth? Or if I covered my manure storage, what might I get from nitrogen savings? Or how will that change my manure application costs? And it tends to increase manure application costs because I'll have more nitrogen in it. I have to haul a little further. Thankfully, I do get more fertilizer value from that, right? Since I held on to some of that nitrogen. And those values can be nice, but they tend to be relatively small compared to the RIN value and the LCFS credits, right? So that's really what would be driving any implementation. I looked at all the costs associated with this and normalized them over 5 or 10 years, depending on what you would demand from a payback period from implementing this. My big costs really are a pipeline injection point. That's about $1 million. So depending on how long you write that off, it's a couple 100,000 a year in profit you need to make, and then a biogas cleaning system, and that over a 5 or 10 year life is another 100 or $200,000 for my project. The important whether I think you can make money or not, I have listed on that very bottom row. If we were a 4,800 head deep pit farm trying to convert and wanted to get paid back in 5 years, I can't do it, right? It's costing me about $150,000 a year. If I'm willing to try and write that expense off over 10 years, think these carbon credit payments are going to be relatively consistent, I'm in the neighborhood of making $50,000 a year. If I started with a dairy or swine lagoon system, right, where I had that outdoor manure storage, had higher emissions to start with, in most cases, we can get those to pay back. I do want to caution you a little bit. That's assuming you're relatively close to a pipeline you can inject to, which may or may not be the case for a given farm. Because of this, it is going to be a little hard to make these systems work in Iowa, and we might have to think about how do we work together? How do we try and make a little bit more gas and have sort of a biorefinery model? I'm going to try and give you a little insight into what I think that looks like for a swine farm here in Iowa. Preface this, I did want to show a picture of Verbio out in Nevada. This is an overhead aerial shot of their facility. You can see there's 8 tanks there in the background next to a little outdoor lagoon. Those 8 tanks are their anaerobic digesters, right? So they're completely mixed heated anaerobic digesters where they're running corn stover as their substrate through it to make natural gas. They do solid separate on the back end, so the spent corn stover gets separated into a dry product. The liquid gets recycled into that lagoon and then reutilized to wet new corn stover to feed their digester. To get the scale we need on many of our farms, we're probably going to have to look at something similar to get there. So what I did in conjunction with a grad student who I think did really nice work on this was look at 4 scenarios. One, a swine farm working all on its own, a 4,800 head swine farm where they just digested the manure. What happens if they co-digest that manure with their corn stover? I have them harvesting 50% of the corn stover from every acre of 70% of the acres that they're putting manure on, right? So it is a pretty aggressive harvest regime, right? To say I'm going to get out and harvest that corn stover from 70% of my acres, and then I'm taking about half of it from those fields. And I chose half because that's roughly what people say we can do to be sustainable. And in this case, that would have to go back as manure onto their field, right? So that corn stover would be replaced after anaerobic digestion. We knew that some of those would be a little hard to utilize. And because of that, I said, what would happen if we had 5 of these farms working together, having a common biogas cleaning system and injection point? Or should we be hauling all their manure, that corn stover, to a single digester facility so that we can get bigger and take advantages of some of those economies of scale? This is just a slide of the assumptions I make as we do that. I think they're pretty reasonable assumptions, but if you are going to plan or thinking about a project, obviously you'd want to evaluate those for your situation. I demanded that we would write this off over a 20-year life, assuming a 7% interest rate. So I do have a little bit longer life on this sort of system. I think it will last that long. That's not my fear, but it is a long-term investment in something where you have to think carefully about what credits might be worth over a longer period of time rather than just the next 5 or 8 years. When it comes to how they work, I looked at this 2 ways. The red bars are if credits, those RIN and LCFS credits, didn't exist. And what you can see is we're nowhere close to getting these systems to pay for themselves if they didn't exist, because that dotted line represents current natural gas prices. In order for these systems to work, they have to be able to make natural gas more cheaply than what I can just go purchase it for, right, with the addition of credits. After credits, on the other hand, we're in much better shape. Many of these hover close to a feasibility or being feasible. With that said, the modeling work we did basically said that if it was just the swine manure from that farm, I wasn't going to make it work. If I started adding corn stovers so that I got a little more gas production, well, over a 20-year period, I could make it work. But that's pretty close to that line, and probably within in the uncertainty of my modeling. Same where it was a few farms working together to share the injection point and the biogas cleaning system. And the only place where I could really have it make money and have a very viable business venture was hauling all that manure to a single digester facility and getting it compressed into the pipeline. I think that is a challenging system to potentially implement. It would mean we're moving manure much more often, and that probably weekly from a farm to the digester, and that can be a challenge as well as commingling the manure and hauling it all back to those farms. I did try and account for all those costs, but there's a social cost of doing that. So, a few things to leave you with. I think there are some markets out there that are developing that could have some potential to impact how we change manure. While currently, as I look around the US, we've seen more of that implementation on covered lagoons, biogas systems. I do think that they might be more select for larger farms or finding ways to collaborate and work together to sort of meet those cost structures. On the other hand, while the market isn't as lucrative, some of those offset markets that pay only $30 a ton per CO2 allow us to think about things like aeration, maybe some of that more frequent manure application or solid separation, and have them be a cost feasible option from our farm. Certainly, this is an area where we'll continue to see some expansion, some more research, and I think especially more investment from some of those companies trying to find sustainability. It is going to change how we manage our manure in Iowa. I think we are blessed with a lot of good, productive soils. We'll continue to utilize it as a resource, but it might change that a little bit. With that, I'd be happy to have any questions and comments. You can see my contact information on the screen. So if there's more you'd like to talk about, please let me know. With that, thank you for watching and hope you have a nice day.